Well, Marcus, I grew up on a farm, and so you see animals die and rot and all of that. It seems to me that the fossils that we have had to have come from a different process than what I saw at the farm.
Yeah, the ability to have fossils at all these wonderful fossils that we've got here, they look all really nice. It takes a lot of work to make them look this way. But yeah, in the modern environments, fossilization is fantastically rare. It's really difficult to get a fossil because you really need the right kinds of conditions. Out on the farm, a cow dies, it gets brought over to a ditch and it just sits there and rots for a long time. And the reason that it sits and rots is because it's not being covered up by sediments, by sand, silt, mud, clay. In order for a fossil to have a chance to be formed, an organism has to die, but it has to be killed under a situation in which there's lots of piling up of sediment. When you see things like the big nautiloid bed in Grand Canyon, it tells you that all of these organisms had to be buried in one moment, and that on top of them has to go a whole bunch of sediment. Otherwise, other organisms, like the ravens and all that sort of thing on the farm, they're going to come and pick a skeleton clean. You've got to seal that away from anything. And on land, you've got certain animals, and in the ocean, you've got plenty of other animals like crabs and lobster and whatnot that go in and just start eating everything. And in the modern world today, when a whale drops out of the top of the ocean and hits the bottom, it is skeletonized. And then once the skeleton is there, there's more worms that go in and start chewing on the skeleton itself. There's no meat left. They're going after the other resources in the bones. So that whale becomes an ecological community to feed a whole bunch of animals, because nature is very efficient at recycling. Very efficient at recycling. So to stop that process, you've got to take that animal, that dinosaurs, like the stuff that we see around here, the trilobites, the nautiloids, you've got to take them out of the equation. You've got to bury them in so much sediment that nobody can get to them. And the conditions for that to occur are very rare on the world today, and yet that seems to be the dominant mode of the rock record. It's fundamentally different from our own experience.
What is it in that data that causes you to think that the Genesis paradigm has the right perspective?
Well, there's a couple of really big key areas. When we think just kind of a helicopter view looking down, there's a few things that point to us very nicely. One is that all these fossils that are found throughout the world are in rock layers that were laid down mostly under marine conditions. There's some that might be grabbing from terrestrial environments and pulling them back in, but dominantly we've got marine organisms on the continents, and that in and of itself is rather striking and surprising, right? You think, well, where are the marine organisms? Well, they're in the ocean. But the sedimentary record of the marine world is actually fantastically good on the continent. There's a lot more marine rocks on the continents than there are terrestrial rocks. And thinking in terms of a paradigm rooted in Genesis, that makes perfect sense. If the floodwaters rose and buried and covered the world, then whatever was in those oceans was drug up and placed out on the continents. We have a tendency to think that fossils are just kind of sprinkled here and there all over the place. But the fossils are only found in sedimentary rocks, so you got to have the right types of rocks around. Not every place has got them. But nonetheless, when you have sedimentary rocks, those fossils tend to be found in distinct layers where there are very, very large numbers that have been destroyed. And so in the limestone or the sandstone that's got the fossils, you might have a bunch of that limestone or sandstone that doesn't have fossils, but then there's a layer of catastrophe. There's a layer in which thousands and thousands of individuals have been buried and destroyed, and their materials have been locked up in these rocks for us to later on discover. So the numbers are mind-boggling in terms of how much is out there. If we took the world and we ran the experiment of the flood again, not that we want that to happen, what you would end up with is the same kind of pattern where you have sedimentary rocks and usually layers within those rocks that are going to have large numbers of fossils. It's the sort of thing that speaks to catastrophe, not the sort of thing where the fossil record is gradually accumulating bone by bone, shell by shell, little by little, over untold eons of time.
So you see it more as a catastrophic graveyard.
It is, and it's a graveyard on top of a graveyard on top of a graveyard, where these pulses of water from the flood are moving over the continents, grabbing ecosystems or dragging marine ones up from deeper in the ocean and pulling them onto land. And as one gets deposited and the waves come back, they start pulling and piling additional stuff on top of that. And so every time we see a layer of rock that's this thick, we're thinking about an event that probably took minutes to make, not thousands of years, minutes for just this one package of rocks, sometimes even seconds. And we know that this can happen from even modern day environments where tsunamis and the like are able to do vast amounts of geological work in effectively a split second.
Marcus, this tsunami waves, I guess you're saying, are they then building up what's called the fossil record?
They are. When a paleontologist talks about the fossil record, he's thinking vertically. He's thinking about different sorts of fossils that are in different layers of rock, and not necessarily something like, well, this one's in a sandstone, this one's in a limestone. They're thinking about what is the position of this fossil with respect to some other species in the fossil record, and thinking in a vertical column sort of situation. We're also thinking a bit about, what type of fossilization is going on, what's the nature and character of the unit. So in some fossil areas, you've got underwater creatures and all the shells are broken to pieces and they're all kind of ripped up together and put into this one big mass. And other times you've got deposits where everybody seems to be perfectly preserved and really nice, like the Burgess Shale, which is got lots of mud, very fine material, and all of these creatures are just pristinely preserved so that we can even see soft part anatomy, things like the feathery gills of a trilobite or the soft tissues of a worm or a mollusk of some kind.
Well, what are some of the other data that you're seeing that convinces you of this paradigm?
Sure. Well, one very curious situation with the fossil record, so thinking vertically about things, is not the hard parts of the animal, but the trackways, the movements that they left behind. So in North America, for example, the first dinosaurs are in what are called Triassic sediments. Now, these are units about halfway up in the fossil record and what I would consider to be about midpoint of the flood or so. But the first record of dinosaurs in North America are not the bones, they're footprints.
Oh, really?
Now, this is a pattern that's repeated in several different areas. Some of our very first amphibian fossils in the rock record, a little bit lower down, are footprints, not hard parts. They're not skeletons, they're not jaws, they're not teeth, they're not bones. This is a pattern that we see in several different groups, trilobites included, where their footprints are first and their body parts are later.
Now, when you say first, you're talking about in lower layers?
Right. A geologist always thinks kind of from the bottom going up, or at least a paleontologist does. So first appearance is the first time I see from the bottom going up a particular type of animal, plant, or creature. For the trilobites, for the amphibians, for the dinosaurs, the first time I find evidence of them in the fossil record, it's from trackways, not the hard parts, not the shells, not the teeth, not the bones. From an old Earth perspective, that's really weird and hard to grapple with because teeth and shells and bones fossilize really well. You have a lot more of those in the fossil record than we have trackways. Because trackways are made on soft mud, they're easy to wipe out. You think about when you go to the beach and you leave some trackways there, they're gone with the next wave. But when it comes to the fossil record from a global flood perspective, starting in Genesis and recognizing that the flood is a dynamic and destructive event, we have evidence of these animals running away from whatever's coming. To have that next wave of sediment bury their tracks and then bury them in maybe the swashback that's coming back from the shore area. And so the discovery of a pattern here, and this is important, it's not just an isolated fact, it's a pattern of trackways followed by bones and teeth and shells that says there's not much time between the formation of this trackway and the discovery of the trilobite or the dinosaur. From an old Earth perspective, you've got to have maybe millions of years between the trackway production and ultimately the animal that made it. But that obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because if there's trackways, there's animals, and those animals have bones and teeth and shells to them. Why aren't they fossilized? You roll the dice that bones and teeth and shells are going to come up first almost every time. But here in the fossil record, it's like you've rolled snake eyes 10 times in a row. Something's wrong with the pattern. Instead, the pattern's telling us something different. There's no time between when somebody leaves a track and when somebody gets buried. The second part is actually a little bit more subtle, gets to another one of those weird patterns in the fossil record, and that is the lack of organisms in the sediment to churn it up. So when you were in the Grand Canyon, you saw lots of layers. That layering is interesting because in the modern world, if you've got nice layers in the ocean, one right after another, all these nice little layers, well, there's animals that dig down and eat all the organic material that's in those layers. You have worms, you have clams, and they're going up and down through all those layers, and as they do, they destroy the layers. But in the fossil record, we have layers and layers and layers and layers and layers. Everything is these really nice fine layers, and there's very little evidence of animals having the time to go and churn up through. So this gets to that trackway. Not only did the trackway have to be buried because on the surface it's easily eroded, it also has to be buried very, very quickly because there are critters that under normal today's circumstances would destroy those things. But the fossil record is showing us something very different from today. It's showing us an environment where organisms are fleeing, they're being buried very quickly, and they're being buried so quickly that the animals don't have time to do their normal day-to-day life. By the more sediment that piles up on top of them, they die.
Right.
They don't have time to live their lives, and we don't see them living their lives in the fossil record.
And the fact that we have so many fossils, instead of millions and millions of different little special events, it seems more plausible that it was a single event.
It does, and recognizing also that the flood is a single event, but a singular event, right? It's something that was altogether different from the rest of human history. And it's a complex sort of thing, and we as creation geologists are only really at the tip of the iceberg trying to figure out the dynamics of the flood. We have a view that the flood is kind of like Winnie the Pooh and the big rain in the 100-acre woods, right? The rain came down in a 100-acre forest.
That's right.
But the reality is this was a tremendously dynamic and destructive event that has a whole bunch of mini events happening within it. And every one of those beds that has the nautiloids, every one of the beds that has a whole range of destroyed dinosaurs, every one of those is a particular event that's happening within the broader context of the destruction of Noah's flood.
Marcus, Stuart and I were talking about the complexity, the design of the creatures. Do you as a paleontologist see that in that fossil record as well?
Absolutely. So in the Cambrian, with the first layers of rock that have lots of fossils in them, called the Cambrian explosion, you have things like trilobites that show up for the first time, looking from the bottom up. And they have eyes, and those eyes are complex, not just a little complex, but tremendously complex. If you've ever taken a look at a dragonfly up close, right, and you see the eye, you see this beautiful round eye, and then up close you look in and there's dozens of little lenses that make up that eye. So the dragonfly can see all over. You can never sneak up on one, right? Trilobites likewise had compound eyes, one eye with dozens of lenses on it that allowed them to see all over the place, behind them, in front of them, on the sides, to avoid predators. For some of the trilobites, though, it got even better. There's a group called the phaeocopsids, and these ones have eyes that not only were able to see all around, but each lens was made up of two different types of minerals, biological minerals, if you will, that allowed them to correct for what happens to water and the distortion that happens in water. So if you try and look underwater, it gets all fuzzy and weird and gets kind of circular. These eyes in some of these trilobites are the most complex eyes in the entire world. We don't even have them anymore. God built them in the trilobites from the very beginning. And it took us thousands of years before we could figure out a design solution that could allow us to perceive light better than a trilobite did. And there's only two different types of lenses that we've ever devised that could do this. The trilobites actually have both of them. And so when we think about the complexity of an organism, you can break it down to its component parts and look at the eyes and say these things are fantastically complicated. And it takes biological information to code for all that. And then that eye also has to be wired into the brain in such a way that the brain is capable of taking in dozens of images at once and forming them into a coherent picture of the world for that organism. These are levels of complexity that far exceed any of our engineering capabilities. None of the cameras that we have built are anywhere near as complicated as some of the first eyes that we see in the lowermost ecosystems. It tells us that when these ecosystems were destroyed, they were fully complex structures, with fully complex organisms, with fully complex components. The complexity just keeps going all the way down.
So again, it makes more sense to think that that life that's in the fossil record was already there and just got captured in its death moments, as opposed to thinking that this is a record that shows how life slowly began to evolve, because it's so complex,
it's
right
so
from the beginning.
And as you go into the rocks below where the trilobites are, you don't find creatures that have slightly less complex eyes and slightly less complex eyes and that gradation that Darwin was expecting and that my colleagues expect to find is still not there. It's not that we haven't been looking. There are hundreds of paleontologists who have been doing a lot of good good work over the past few hundred years, and yet the pattern still shows us complexity comes first, and variations on the themes of those complexities come later. That's exactly what we do as engineers and as intelligent agents ourselves. When we create things, we come up with an idea, we create a pattern, we create a system, it's complex, it's whole, it's integrated, and then we decide we want to tweak it. Somebody comes up with an invention, it works good, but then the modifications come around. And not that God has to modify his creatures, but the pattern of an idea and the variations on those ideas are exactly the signal that we get from design systems, and not the signal that you get from things that arise organically out of physics and chemistry.
Do you see that same complexity in the design as you see it in the eye of a trilobite? Now when we come to these amazing engineered creatures that are right here in dinosaurs and the creatures that flew.
Yeah, so for example, we've got this Apatosaurus behind us. This is the long-necked dinosaur. It's big, and it's one of the largest animals ever to walk on Earth. It weighed a couple dozen tons, and it's got to be able to support that weight as it walks on land, because they probably didn't spend a lot of time swimming in swamps despite the early dinosaur books that we had. These animals are built to be on land. Now, that Apatosaurus, you can see the front legs down over there and down towards the toes. It's actually walking on its toes. Its fingers are like this. But the fingers have to, if you and I just tried to do that on our toes all day,
I wouldn't last long.
It's not going to last long. And so the design feature that we see here is actually that the fingers curl around into a column to help distribute the weight evenly across the front paw of the animal. The back legs are doing the same thing. Our hands and our feet are more or less flat, one way or the other. But the Apatosaurus and all of its close kin that have these big long necks and these huge bodies, those structures are rolled into a column so that the weight can be distributed evenly amongst the toes that are going to the ground. There's probably a big pad of flesh down behind it to help add a little bit of surface area. Elephants do the same sort of thing. These are the types of structures that are design marvels, right? They're engineering approaches to distributing weight. And even the long neck and the really long tail on these sorts of things are effectively cantilevers. They are held out by tendons and ligaments in order to keep them nice and stiff and straight so that you don't have to use a lot of muscle to hold up your tail. Instead, you've got a kind of like an iron bar of a tendon holding these things out. So when I get a chance to look up close at something like this Apatosaurus or any of the other dinosaurs and other animals that are out there, you start looking at the details of their anatomy and go, wow, this fulfills this function. This does this role, this performs this for the animal. And this is not the sort of thing that ends up accumulating by happenstance. Despite natural selection's capabilities of kind of selecting some things that work, natural selection tinkers with things. And tinkering is something that you can do once something is built. You don't tinker your way into a complex structure. You tinker around with it. And so looking at these animals, complexity from tip to snout, from one end to the other, and all of that is shown in a variety of different skeletal structures.
And we're talking about exquisite design just within a land animal, but we also have not only sea creatures, but we have creatures that fly, but for me is an amazing, amazing capability.
Yeah, they don't have jet propulsion, they don't have propellers, so how do they do it? And bats fly, birds fly, and pterosaurs, which are extinct, fly. Those are the three animals that really have powered flight that are vertebrates. We've got insects and whatnot, and they have their own amazing systems for doing these sorts of things. If you want to fly, you've got to be lightweight. Hollow bones are something that both pterosaurs and birds have in order to lighten the weight. You tend to have very compact bodies. There's a couple of pterosaur fossils that are around here. And the middle of those animals are actually really small. And the design of the wings is spectacular. For a pterodactyl, they actually have their pinky is the big wing. Right? They've got a couple of fingers that stick out, but those are to help them walk along on the ground when they come down. But the pinky finger is enormous and holds out to the end, and there's a flap of skin that goes from there all the way down to their ankle. And that flap of skin is made up of at least 3 different layers of material that we know from soft tissue preserved fossils. So we've got a chance to see a little bit of the actual anatomy of the animal in these. And you've got thin muscle layers, you've got a layer of blood vessels, you also have some specialized material that no other animal on the planet has got in order to make this thing do what it does. And scenarios in which evolution has got to produce these things without any forethought to what's going on into the future simply don't have the capacity to create something this complicated.
Well, Mark, this is very interesting to me because I remember hearing stories of how animals just all of a sudden grew wings. And yet what you're saying is that that animal had to be fully ready to fly, hollow bones and all of those kind of things. It couldn't just grow a wing and then start flying.
Right. I mean, the mechanics of flight are very demanding. And as someone who's been in the Air Force, you understand that. So you can't just happenstance your way by growing a little bit longer wing digit or growing a little bit smaller body trunk or growing a little bit more kind of feathery, fluffy material in order to eventually become a bird. There's got to be functionality from the beginning point all the way to the end. That's a very demanding sort of problem. You know, what good is half the wing going to do for you? Because there's a certain practicality that's necessary for being on the ground, and there's a certain practicality that exists for being in the air.